Hello. A little bit of old history here. In 537, around about that time, the barbarians cut the aqueducts that fed water to Rome, and Rome squandered into a pit of disease, a village. It became a backwater, leaving Byzantium to control the rest of the empire. And Byzantium was quite happy to surrender Rome to the barbarians. Why? Because the barbarians were in charge of the energy supply. Putin is in charge of the energy supply. Now, we may also look back over the last few years and look at what Mr. Putin has been saying consistently. He wants to make Russia great again. He wants to make himself great again. His vision of power for himself is to be seen as the person who restores Russia's dignity. This is, in fact, the only way that he can maintain power. He cannot maintain power by doing what he's been doing for the last decade or two. It simply isn't possible. He has to retain power on a permanent basis, hence he changed the law. He has to become, in everything but name, the new Tsar. And that means that he's thinking of himself in the line of succession with people like Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, in the line of great military leaders like Souverain, who conquered the Crimea. And Catherine the Great and Peter the Great, of course, were responsible for annexing the Ukraine. The Ukraine, which in Russian simply means the edge, the borderland. Putin has made no secret of the fact that he wants to revive the Tsarist Empire. He's not reviving the USSR empire. There was no empire. He's looking further back, and in fact, in his office, he's got a statue of Peter the Great. When you go into Moscow, there's a huge statue of Peter the Great anyway in the river. You cannot avoid this image. For Putin, there are two images. Just behind the statue of Peter the Great is the revived cathedral. The cathedral which had been demolished by the Bolsheviks and which became the site of an open-air swimming pool. That cathedral has been rebuilt so hastily that it's now sinking, but it's still rebuilt. I've been in it. It's magnificent. Now, Mr. Putin, like Peter the Great, like Catherine the Great, like the great Russian generals, understands the power of force. He understands the power of the fist. He understands what it is to be a bully in the face of people who are going to back down. And that's it. That's it. He's already amassed a war chest. He doesn't care about sanctions. He's got $500 billion in his back pocket. Putin was prepared for war. And the West, we're not prepared for war. We're prepared for a scandal about having a party. We're prepared for a squabble about welfare. We're prepared for further anxieties about COVID. And we look at Mr. Putin and we look at that long table and we look at the arrangements around his stage television appearances. And oh my goodness, look at the distance between him and everybody else. And we say, oh yes, this is because Mr. Putin also cares about COVID. Mr. Putin cares about an assassin's knife. Mr. Putin isn't worried about COVID. And then at the same time, we look around to see who is supporting Mr. Putin. Well, Mr. Putin commands support. It's a very small part of the world which is democratic. The larger part of the world is not. So, of course, Mr. Putin commands support from China. Of course, Mr. Putin entertains Pakistan. Because we are distracted and The rest of the world recognizes the threat of force, and they do not want to be in the way of destruction. So they get on the other side. More than that, Mr. Putin has made it very clear that he is prepared for nuclear war. Are we? I think we are obsessed with the fantasy of international law, with the fantasy of human rights. These things are important. But in the face of brute force, what's going to happen? Is brute force going to cave in and say, oh, you're mentioning international law, you're mentioning human rights? No, brute force is going to slap us down. Brute force is going to laugh in the face of the Liz Trusses who don't know what they're talking about and who try and posture on a world stage and try and speak down to a bully without knowing what they're doing, without having done their homework. We have fielded the worst possible people against President Putin. President Putin has taken one look at the opposition that he faces and sniggered into his stacked shoes and gone ahead with what he'd already planned. We have been living in a fantasy world. It's now time for us to embrace reality, I'm afraid. And the reality is not pleasant.